The International School for Development Justice at UWI presents the SDGs and Youth, Making Connections for Progress webinar series. Starting September 17th and continuing on every third Wednesday of the month, we explore the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, what they are, their impact on Caribbean people, and the progress and challenges we face. Join us for 12 dynamic sessions with local and global experts. Ask questions, share your story, and make connections for progress. The SDGs and You webinar series. Register today.
Welcome to all of you. I have a couple of people in the waiting room that I'm just going to let in now. I would ask you to mute your mics so make sure that everyone can hear. Welcome, welcome. Again, my name is Laura Pilgrim, and our speaker for today, we are blessed to have Dr. David Smith. Dr. David Smith coordinates the Institute for Sustainable Development at the University of the West Indies. He is a member of the UN High-Level Advisory Board on Economic and Social Progress, the Science Policy Advisory Committee of the Inter-American Institute for Global Change Research, and the Caribbean Chair for the Sustainable Development Solutions Network. He was also an author of the Global Sustainable Development Report in 2019. Dr. Smith works on environmental management, managing disaster risk, and the effects of climate change on human well-being in small island development states. So the speaker will have about 35 minutes to share, and then there will be 15 minutes for questions from you. So over to you, Dr. Smith, and welcome again.
Excellent. All right. So yes, I'd like to talk a bit about Sustainable Development Goal number 13. That's climate action. Despite the picture, I don't want us to get the impression that climate change and climate action, even in the Caribbean or other small island developing states, is all about cyclones. But I thought we could start here. It's a rather interesting picture, given that there are 4 tropical cyclones in that single picture. But let's talk a bit about the goal itself. Just to remind everybody, there are 17 Sustainable Development Goals. These are all of them, but I'm sure you all know that already. What are the targets for Goal 13? First one is about strengthening resilience. Resilience is very important, and adaptive capacity to climate-related hazards. And there's a suite of hazards. We will get into that a little later. And many of those hazards cause disasters. So there's a need as well to try to integrate climate change into national policies, national strategies and planning, improve education, awareness raising, and making sure that people understand how to do 2 particular things. One is mitigate climate change. That's try to do things that stop climate change from happening, and also to adapt to the climate that is already been changed. And you'll see that in different parts of the planet, the relative importance of those 2 actions will vary. And the target is also looking at reducing the impact of climate change and trying to figure out ways of helping people to be warned early enough so they can take precautions. There are 2 other targets. One has to do with funding, and that's particularly important. That has to do with Global Climate Fund and making sure there's enough money in it, and that fund puts money out and helps people and countries to be able to figure out what to do about climate change and also to try to stop it. And there's also another target which looks at countries in special development situations, figuring out how to plan and manage efforts regarding climate change in least developed countries, but also notice the inclusion of small island developing states. And then that also focuses on marginalized communities and more vulnerable sections of those communities, including young people and women. So have we made progress? Yes, some progress. The UN reports that less people died in disasters between 2014 and 2023 than in the previous decade. And in terms of disaster risk reduction strategies, 131 countries now have those. Unfortunately, 2024 was the hottest year recorded in 172 years. And during 2024, it's very likely that we passed the 1.5 degree threshold in terms of warming the planet. So it's likely that we are more than 1.5 degrees warmer than historical values. That's not good for a variety of different reasons, which we'll get into shortly. And more money is being spent on climate action. So that's good as well. When we looked at sustainable development, jumping back to this whole idea of the goals, we found that there were 4 big problems that get in the way of progress on any of the goals and helping the world to achieve progress on the goals as a whole. One of them is waste. Another is inequality. Waste, we're familiar with, it ends up in the oceans and fish. It also ends up in the human body. And I'm sure we've seen the articles about microplastics and how there are more microplastics in the ocean than there are fish. But we've also seen the ones about microplastics end up in human tissue. And there's recent scientific evidence that microplastics can be passed on by a woman to her unborn child. Inequality increases after adverse events, but is a major driver of problems in terms of human development. Climate change is also a major driver in terms of problems of human development, and it leads to increased adverse events. Biodiversity loss increases vulnerability of communities and increases the severity and number of adverse events as well. And if you have more adverse events, that increases inequality. And increased equality increases vulnerability, decreases human and social capital. And so you end up with this sort of vicious cycle of waste, inequality, climate change, biodiversity, bad things happening, and life getting worse, particularly for people who are at the bottom of society in terms of their ability to find funding, to find the things that they need to survive, and to improve their well-being. This is just 2 of the Sustainable Development Reports. The 2019 one on the right, that was the first Global Sustainable Development Report. The 2023 report that came out, which then looked to see, well, how are we doing? Unfortunately, the Global Sustainable Development Report of 2023 found that we are not doing very well, partly because of COVID, but definitely because of other things as well. And they found that in terms of some of the Sustainable Development Goals, we're actually going in completely the wrong direction. So we're not doing very well. There are a few goals which we may be making progress on, but by and large, the world needs to pay more attention to how to progress in the Sustainable Development Goals. In terms of planetary boundaries, the work done by Catherine Richardson and the others who are down there are looking at different boundaries for safe operation of human society, essentially. The safe operating space at the center, the green bit, is what they've figured out is the limits for human society. So when they talk about ocean acidification, it's acidified because it's absorbing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and it gets acidic. That little line, the circle there and the green, is showing the outer limit for human survival in terms of good quality human survival. Unfortunately, in terms of 9 of the planetary boundaries, we've exceeded the safe operating space for humanity in 6 of them, which means that basically a lot more people are suffering. The well-being of humans generally is depreciating, but most importantly, for those who are at the bottom of the social ladder, those who have been discriminated against for one reason or another, inequality very much plays a role here, not just between countries, but within countries as well. And that leads, of course, to things that we may be unfortunately familiar with: destroyed homes, refugees, people protesting even in OECD countries, and floods and other kinds of problems that severe weather has caused. We should also be concerned about what are referred to as tipping points. This particular paper, which came out in 2022, talks about a whole series of tipping points. Tipping points are situations that relate to extremely quick change. The causes that led to that change may have taken a few decades to build up, but once they get to a particular limit, all of a sudden there's a rapid change, and it's a rapid change not in our favor. We in the small island developing states should be extremely concerned about the low latitude coral reef die-off. That is, coral reefs dying off within a decade or so after the triggering point has been reached. We would also be concerned about many of the other tipping points as well, but notice that the circle there for the low latitude coral reef die-off indicates that this is likely to happen around 2 degrees centigrade warming. And we mentioned we'd already gone over 1.5 degrees probably last year. Coral reefs are very important to the economy of pretty much all small island developing states. And speaking of small island developing states, we have an acknowledged reputation for being island paradises. On the right is a picture of one of the island paradises known as the Grand Cayman. And this picture was taken after Hurricane Ivan. So you can see that there was obviously at some point some aspects of paradise. The homes look quite nice, even though they are damaged. And you can see from the boats as well that there was definitely something going on there. But how do we characterize small island developing states? We, for the most part, have very high dependence on tourism. And many of the small island developing states are among the most tourism-dependent economies on the planet. Unfortunately, we spend very little money conserving or managing the coastal ecosystems that support the coastal tourism that is the mainstay of most of our economies. And we suffer from high costs and high levels of erosion of the coastal environment. I looked at the budget of the Jamaican government at some point, along with some colleagues, and we found that in 2022, they spent 1% of their budget on climate change. We'll talk more about that later. But we also need to bear in mind that climate change or new climate regimes don't happen all over the surface of the globe at the same time. The tropics will tend to experience new climates before the rest of the world. And this is work done by the University of Hawaii. And you'll hear more, you'll see the references a little later. So despite the Paris Agreement and the COPs that we keep having, tropics are going to experience and will have to adapt to new climate regimes. We can expect increased drought, changed rainfall patterns. We may get the same amount of rain in a month, but it all falls on a particular day. We can expect increased temperature and changes in temperature regimes. We will expect more floods, stronger cyclones, and sea level rise. These are dates for new climates. Notice that Kingston and other Caribbean countries occur much before Berlin, Moscow, London, Paris, Washington, and so on in that second column. And this work is done by Camilo Mora and his colleagues from University of Hawaii. So tropical and subtropical countries must adapt to new climate regimes. Our temperatures are already higher. Our rainfall patterns are already changing. Major hurricanes are becoming more frequent, and the ocean is more acidic than it was. If we look at what is referred to as climate departure is when you get new climate regimes and there's no chance of going back to the old regimes. The work done by the scientists at the University of Hawaii looked at what was the climate up to about 2005, and then tried to figure out what will be the first point when you see permanent change for different ecosystems and also for different cities. So if you go onto the internet, you'll see where the different cities change over. And this is information about critical ecosystems. These are critical ecosystems for tourism and critical ecosystems for small island developing states. Coral reefs, seagrasses, and mangroves are all extremely important for fisheries. Fisheries are a vital component of food for small island developing states populations. And as these ecosystems start to experience new and different temperatures, the problem is that these are not temperatures which they are used to, and these are temperatures which are likely to bring degradation. So work published by scientists back in 2019 looked at tipping points for the coral reefs. And one of the scientists in that paper was at the University of the West Indies, one of the leaders of the climate studies group at Mona. And they figured out that if you get too close to 2 degrees, or if you pass 1.5 degrees, you're looking at about 70% of coral reefs worldwide being lost. And when you get to 2 degrees, you're looking at about 90 to 99% of coral reefs worldwide being lost. So that's obviously extremely bad news for anybody who is living at the coast of a small island developing state, and particularly those people who get their food from coral reefs, mangroves, and seagrasses. And for people living on the coast, that's an awful lot of the people living on coasts get their food from these places. And also, for those of us who are not concerned too much about that in terms of food, the mainstay of most SIDS economies is tourism, and it's based entirely on having healthy coral reefs, healthy mangroves, and healthy seagrass beds, because pretty much all our tourism is based on white sand beaches. So what do we have to look forward to in terms of Caribbean small island developing states? For the Caribbean, we expect fewer cyclones, which may be a good thing, but not necessarily, because the cyclones we get will be stronger than cyclones we're used to getting. So we're going to expect more major hurricanes, and less hurricanes overall. So we'll go less far down the alphabet, but we will be seeing more 3, 4, and 5 category storms. And those storms, in addition to having stronger winds, will also carry more moisture, so they'll lead to more flooding. We will expect longer, drier summers. We tend to have a summer drought during in the Caribbean. We're going to see increased possibility of that. They will be drier. That will also increase the risk of fires. We are going to expect to see hotter days and also warmer nights. That's going to increase the need for cooling in homes and in classrooms. That's going to have deleterious effects on older people and also on children. So we're going to expect changed rainfall, drought and floods. That's going to affect agriculture. We're going to expect an increase in air temperature. So that will increase heat stress and cause an increase in dehydration. We're expecting less cyclones, but they will be wetter, and we will have stronger wind speeds. So we're going to expect more damage from floods, more damage from hurricanes and tropical storms, increased potential for loss of life, and increased economic impacts from severe weather. So when we think about fewer hurricanes, but the hurricanes are wetter and stronger, let's think back a little bit. Hurricane Ivan in 2004 caused 180% of GDP damage and loss in Grenada. It hit Grenada directly. It also hit Grand Cayman directly as well. It caused 200% loss in GDP in the Cayman Islands. Now, what does this mean? It means that when we looked at the damage and loss using the standard methods by the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, we found out damage is literally that damage to homes, to infrastructure, and so on. And loss looks at the loss in economic activity that's caused because of the damage and because of the passage of the storm. And then you compare that to GDP so you can get a better idea rather than just saying it was X billion dollars. You need to compare that to what is the GDP of the country in terms of what do they generate in a year. So when you see 180% of GDP, that means essentially that it's nearly 2 years of earnings and so on that was lost in that single day in Grenada, and 2 years worth in the Cayman Islands. But we also should bear in mind, in terms of Category 5 hurricanes that hit land, Irma and Maria did so in 2017. This is, now we're looking at recent times. Dorian did so in 2019, and Melissa did so in 2025. That's over 8 years. Every other year, a Category 5 hurricane, that's the most powerful category that we have currently, hit a Caribbean island. So how will climate change likely affect SIDS? If we're looking at health, we're going to see increased vector-borne diseases, all the things that mosquitoes carry, for example, but there are also plenty of other insect vectors that are quite happy to make you sick. Increased heat makes them reproduce much faster and grow much faster, and they are much better at carrying diseases. There's increased heat stress. There's also increased diseases that aren't vector-borne. The work done by the scientists in University of Hawaii found that about 58% of pathogenic diseases are made worse in terms of their transmission and so on by increased climate change. You're looking at labor hours lost for a variety of reasons. Some people may not be well enough, and some people may not be able to work in the heat that is now the new regime. Negative effects on mental health. In terms of the tourism sector, outdoor comfort will be reduced. Your guests may not want to go outside between, say, 11 and 3 in the afternoon. So they'll just sit around maybe inside the hotel room with the air conditioner turned up, or maybe they'll do other things outdoors, but it might mean that the attractiveness of your tourism product may be reduced as well. So we need to start looking at how we address that. In terms of agriculture, most of our pests are insects, but even the ones that aren't insects, they're going to be much, much more effective in changed climates. You're going to need to change your planting regimes because the times you used to plant in order to anticipate rain, that's not when it rains anymore. And we'll lose crops because of cyclones, because of floods, because of drought. We're going to be concerned about bleaching of corals and also the coral reef tipping point. And we're going to need to be concerned about increased indoor temperatures, the need for climate control indoors. Work done by colleagues at the University of the West Indies, particularly Dr. Georgiana Gordon-Strawn, who is at the medical center over not too far away from me, the Tropical Metabolism Research Institute, looked at what's likely to happen to SIDS, and this is part of the Lancet Countdowns work, Lancet being the British Medical Journal. They're looking at climate and health worldwide. Leading the effort for small island states is the University of the West Indies and Dr. Georgiana Gordon-Strawn. So what are the results for the first report? Number of deaths attributable to health between 2017 and 2022 for SIDS is double what was taking place between 2000 and 2005. Increased numbers of infants and older persons are exposed to heat waves. People aged 65 or older in SIDS were exposed to 103 days per year of health-threatening heat between 2018 and 2022. And that's up from an average of 53 days a year. So it's double the risk. With increased heat and outdoor exercise will expose people to increased heat and heat stress. So the kinds of things that you do to exercise and make yourself more healthy may also lead to increased health risk. So we also should think about, though, the economy in our small island paradises. Unfortunately, most of our economies depend almost completely on natural capital. Beach tourism depends on coral reefs, mangroves, seagrass beds, and comfortable temperatures, and requires a fair amount of water. And that water must be properly managed because all our water resources are finite. We have to manage our underground sources, protect them from pollution, manage the surface sources and protect our watersheds, and address inequality in water access. And bear in mind that if we are looking at increased droughts or rainfall patterns changing, the beautiful waterfall that you see there could become a raging torrent and then go dry for the next 3 months. Our tourism dependency is something which we need to take into account. When I mentioned the tourism, tropical reef tipping point, on the left, that's just reminding us that even if warming is only a 1.5 degrees, exceeding 2 degrees is going to drive the loss of about 99% of reef building corals. But it also affects organisms that depend on coral reefs for their habitat, that's fish and biological diversity. So driving climate change, driving the loss of coral reefs will affect, yes, our tourism, but also our food. So it was suggested by Gounder and Cox that our fragile economies need to develop appropriate economic diversification strategies. We've got to stop just having so much dependent on one sector. That doesn't mean we shouldn't do tourism. It means we need to rapidly start doing other things as well. The picture, by the way, some of you should recognize that. It's a beautiful part of Barbados. And I think you'll agree that the beach is beautiful. It's just unfortunately completely covered in sargassum in this particular picture. Didn't mention sargassum, but yes, the sargassum blooms are definitely partly driven by climate change. The oceans are warmer and the sargassum grows better there, but it's also the sargassum is being fertilized by agricultural runoff from Southern Africa and also the Southern American continent. It ends up on our beaches and it threatens our tourism, as I'm sure many of us are well aware. So what are the threats in terms of what climate change is doing? It negatively affects our coastal ecosystem. It increases our heat, it increases coastal erosion. There's the coral reef tipping point. We are also, though, in addition to climate change, adding solid and liquid waste to our coastal environments. And we are also sometimes not managing our forests properly, which means that our ability to pull carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and thus help to mitigate climate change is being reduced. And also because forests provide other services to our coastal zone, we're seeing concerns with regard to the coastal integrity of many of our countries. So our infrastructure is exposed to hazards. We have potential for extremely high economic damage because our economic base is narrow, but it's also not just sometimes not built for Category 5 hurricanes, but even where it is built for Category 5 hurricanes, we still have a lot of hangover of, let's say, poorly built or poorly located infrastructure. So our hotels are on the beach, our roads are on the coast, our airport runways are low in elevation and beside the sea. So let's talk a bit about how that worked in terms of Melissa. Melissa had 185 mile per hour sustained winds. By the way, that was faster than the fastest wind speeds ever recorded in Europe, the United Kingdom, and Canada. Climate change increased that maximum wind speed by 7%. Climate change increased economic damage by 34%. And climate change increased extreme rainfall by 16%. And this is all based on work done by scientists from the University of the West Indies, the Cuban Institute for Meteorology, and also Imperial College London. And we will circulate, there's a brochure which will give you all that information a little later. The hurricane rapidly went from being a tropical storm to a major Category 4 hurricane in 18 hours. This map shows a couple of things. The blue line in the middle that zigzags across Jamaica is the path of the eye. The red dots, or the red pins, show hospitals. And in most of them, it shows how close the eye came to those hospitals. So for Falmouth, on the north coast, the eye came within 2.5 kilometers. The Cornwall Regional Hospital, 7 kilometers. Lucy, much further away, 28 kilometers. Savannah Lamar, 14 kilometers, and Black River, which was totally destroyed, 11 kilometers. What's not shown in this is the fact that Black River, Lucy, and Falmouth are hospitals located where you would expect to find, in another universe, hotels, because they are right on the coast. Literally, in all cases, less than 100 meters away from the shore. So when the storm surge came in, and when they had these major winds, they were very, very, very badly affected, badly damaged, not just by the wind, but also the sea coming into the hospital as well. So how do we fix all this? Because we have to fix it. It's not going away. We have to not so much be worried about mitigating climate change, because we're not contributing very much to the problem, but adapting to it. The data from the Ministry of Finance show where the money is coming from, despite the fact that there is the Global Climate Fund, despite the fact that you can get loans and grants to look at addressing climate change, it's still hard to get that money. As a result, the Ministry of Finance and the government of Jamaica is still putting in more than 50% of its own money to deal with climate-related expense. Despite the fact that prominent economists don't see any financial obstacles to getting to net zero and fixing the problem, we still need more capital, and particularly in SIDS, we're not getting that capital. Part of the reason for that is down here where it says, and this is note that this is the IMF saying that you need to improve access to funds, reduce administrative hurdles. Cumbersome administrative requirements from the fund's limited SIDS capacities to meet their requirements. If the IMF is saying that your administrative requirements are cumbersome, you know they are cumbersome. Businesses need to look at being able to increase their insurance coverage and creating disaster continuity plans and so on and so forth. But bear in mind that simply because you're insured doesn't mean that the hotel, restaurant, or business will come back. They may pocket the money and say, I'm leaving, I'm going somewhere else. And that happened a lot in the Cayman Islands. Future actions. We need to build human capital so we can diversify our economies. You can't diversify an economy unless you build human capital. You need to manage the natural capital that we have, value our ecosystems, include them in cost-benefit calculations, and put enough money into our savings and spending so that we protect those ecosystems, because sometimes those ecosystems will protect us. Use natural means to build resilience as well as civil engineering and other means. Make sure that our infrastructure, wherever possible, is properly built and located. So one of the things Jamaica will have to do, and our Prime Minister's already said it, is move some of particularly our lifelines out of harm's way. So we've got at least 3 hospitals to move away from the coast. And of course, we have to address inequalities in access, inequalities in the ability to rebuild and recover. In terms of energy, we need to increase our efficiency of energy and drop carbon producing sources. So increase our solar and our wind and other renewables. And one of the things that Jamaica is also doing is looking at nuclear as well to be able to provide that bedrock you need for the times when you're not able to generate from renewables. In terms of climate change, we need to adapt and we need to mitigate whenever possible, but we've got to make sure that we have plans for our worst case scenario, because unfortunately, the worst case scenario seems to be happening every other year for the Caribbean. Managing our natural resources, conserving, dealing with the waste, the inequality, climate change and biodiversity management, and making sure that when we are looking at disaster risk reduction and resilience, that we remember that there are other hazards that aren't related to climate change and that we need to build for those hazards as well. It's not enough to say, oh, okay, we got hit by Melissa and we will make sure that Melissa doesn't harm us in this way again. That's very important. But we also need to bear in mind that, say, for example, in Montego Bay, they have earthquake risk, and that we have earthquakes and we have all kinds of hazards in the Caribbean. Earthquakes, volcanoes, you name it, we've probably got it. And we need to have disaster risk reduction and resilience plans for all the hazards. I've also added some references as well, and we will make arrangements, I believe, so that you will be able to get a copy of the presentation later. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Smith. That was quite a thorough address regarding the problem of SDG 13. Thank you so much. So now I'm going to open the floor to questions. If you have a question for Dr. Smith, please do raise your hand and I'll call on you, and then you will be able to open your mic and ask your question. I know there's a lot of thinking going on. All right, go ahead, Felicity Darvico.
Darville, yes. Good morning. I wanted to ask about the role that ministries of social services needs to be playing because of the loss of life when it comes to these natural disasters, and also the trauma related, because here in the Bahamas, when they announced Hurricane Melissa, there was a lot of anxiety based on us still recovering from Dorian. So I'm actually just joining a force with the Ministry of Social Services.
Yeah, it's a very important role. I think a role that's been maybe not paid as much attention to in the past as we should. There's definitely a bit more understanding and consciousness of this. I'm seeing this in the Jamaican response, a little bit more understanding from, say, the Ministry of Health, not necessarily from social services as such, but definitely Ministry of Health and health practitioners are making much more of a concerted effort to help people to understand that mental health and well-being is definitely a casualty of these kinds of events. There's also a colleague who I think was making a presentation at a last week. There was a medical conference held at Mona, and one of the people presenting was a medical practitioner, and also she is part of the, I think, the American University in Antigua and Barbuda. And she made a very important presentation about mental health there as well. And so people the medical profession is definitely becoming more and more, not so much conscious, but weighing in on this and helping governments or trying to get governments to understand that this is particularly important. Work we did, for example, in Dominica, this came up again as well. And we definitely need a lot more investment, a lot more services made available to people who have been not just victims in the sense that their homes may have been destroyed, but also looking at the damage that was done to their mental well-being as well.
Thank you for that response, Dr. Smith. We have another question from Lois. Go ahead, please.
Thank you. Hi, Dr. Smith.
Hi.
My question is kind of related to the one that was just raised. It has to do with loss and damage. So when you were speaking about loss and damage, you mentioned economic. And I think it's clear at this point that we need to look a bit beyond direct economic impacts in terms of how we quantify. For example, I know with Melissa, there's a lot of heritage loss. So many churches, 400 years old, apparently, that literally there's only a foundation left, if anything. And so I think there's a lot of implications coming out of that, not just for the heritage, but in terms of culture, where folks, even entire villages might need to be relocated, things like that. So if you can speak to some of the work that's going on in terms of how we expand the definition of loss and damage to reflect the realities on the ground, and then also related to the impacts on health, as my colleague just mentioned, in terms of mental health. We already have issues going on in the Caribbean, into looking at, for example, rising suicide rates. And I think mental health impacts, yes, for those directly impacted, but the anxiety as well, particularly I think with Melissa, because of the track the hurricane took, and essentially every day, landing was delayed by another day and another day. And I think the impacts of that were not entirely clear in terms of even those in the East who may not have had direct impacts on their infrastructure and livelihoods, but even their mental health would have been impacted. And we want to make sure that that's not being underestimated. But we also related to that diagram you showed in terms of the health network and how that impacts NCD management. And again, in this region where we have such high rates of NCDs, I'm not sure if that's also being captured. So just wanted to get your thoughts on those.
Professor Winston Moore, I think he's based in the Cave Hill campus, has done a lot of work on looking at what we were, I guess, the standard ways in which we measure damage and loss, and the ways in which that has not taken into account many other things which also should probably be measured in terms of loss and damage. So it's beyond the mechanism that the ECLAC, the Economic Commission of Latin America and the Caribbean, use it. And definitely ECLAC is going in to do one specific thing. They want to figure out what was broken and how much did you lose, so that they can set a target and try to start now going to other countries and figuring out, well, how badly was this country hit and how quickly can we help them get back on their feet. So for that particular purpose, it's fine, but it's not, and it's probably never intended to be a comprehensive categorization of everything that was lost or damaged in the particular event. And one of the problems that we have is that we haven't really come up with ways of measuring the long period of time and measuring things that may not have happened in the event itself in its immediate aftermath. So one of the things we learned, for example, with the hurricane in 2017 hitting Puerto Rico, was that, yes, there were people who died in the storm, but when you look at up to 6 to 8 months later, there were people who died as a result of the storm, which would not have been counted before. And so when you start looking at the time for recovery, the losses in terms of employment and how long it takes to get back to not where you were the day before the storm struck, but where you would have been had the storm never hit in the first place. We are nowhere near figuring out how to do that kind of work. We have an idea, but we're not doing it yet. And we do need to start measuring and watching and monitoring for a much longer period so that countries can fully recover. Because the problem is, if you are only looking at counting part of the cost, and then that means then you're not equipping yourself to get back everything that you lost. And that's what one of the problems that we're seeing. Repeated events cause the development of countries to go back further and further. So you may take one step forward, but you take 2 steps backwards. And that is a big problem, and something that we should be looking at more and trying to figure out what are the economic ways of being able to figure out the long-term effect and how long it will take to get back to where you should have been. When we went into the Cayman Islands after Ivan, we figured it would probably take 6 years to rebuild physically if they were rebuilding at the fastest rate they ever built before. But that was simply to get them to where they were the day before the event. So after 6 years, they'd be where they were 6 years ago. You still have to then add on to that, where would you have been had the event never happened? And we haven't got there yet. We still need to come up with ways of doing that.
Thank you for that. We have another question from Sasha Goodrich. Go ahead, Sasha, please.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. So my question related to the diversification of the economies. And since our economies, so many of our economies are built on tourism, the idea of the sand, the sea, and the sun, as you pointed out. And where the economies are debt burdened and have limited funds, coupled with the fact that we have had years of slavery where our soils would have been abused. With I know for Barbados for sure, our soils are not as fertile. So my question is how, and knowing that the climate change is affecting us, like Barbados just went through a flood. I call it, we are having freak storms or flooding, just rain just pouring, and we're not really prepared for that, damaging our roads, homes, everything. People losing lives. So how can we diversify given all those things?
One of the groups that's responding to the problems caused by Melissa is a group it's working in the background, trying to make sure everyone knows what everyone's doing and can track what's happening and so on. But what it's doing is really an IT aid to the relief and recovery effort. It's interesting because it's hired most of the people, if not, there are maybe 2 or 3 people who are there from abroad, and everybody else is Jamaican, and they're all young IT people working, either they're doing programming or they're doing work on the software and the system that is helping to support that aspect of the relief effort. The company itself wants to create about 1,000 IT jobs in Jamaica. They are particularly interested in looking to see if they can do a fair amount of those in the areas which were hit badly by Melissa. There are all kinds of things we can do. When we as Caribbean people migrate to OECD countries, we don't do tourism. So we've got to start emancipating ourselves, as Mr. Marley said, from our mental slavery and stop thinking that, yes, okay, we're great at tourism. We do it very, very well. We can do other things as well. But to do those other things, we need to make sure that we have every single school leaver, every single tertiary education leaver being at the level where they can fit into a job on the international scale and do it. And then when we have people at that level, we don't necessarily have to have them all go and migrate to those economies. We can have, using IT and various other things, have many of those jobs be done offshore. We've done that before. And a lot of countries do that. There are other things that we can do, but we've got to add on to. We can't do tourism alone. You can't build an economy on one leg.
Sorry, can I follow up a question? I agree with you, but that requires then vision for our education systems. and it requires also trend analysis in terms of the areas in which are going to be I don't know if the lack of ever available or areas that are going to be developed that we can as a Caribbean people flow into, but that also requires a lot of planning on the part of the governments and agencies. So I hear you, but
It sounds like you're skeptical that our governments will do the right thing.
I'm not sure if I'm skeptical. I am just it sounds good, but on the ground, my question is, you said emancipate yourself from mental slavery, but do we think, I'm asking if we have the thinking processes or the frame of mind to really do what you are saying in terms of setting that framework to move in those directions, or even moving people out from just survival mode of living to more long-term developmental strategy for our Caribbean development. So, and that is on the ground back up. So
Yeah. Okay. So one of the things I think we unfortunately keep doing, I was at a meeting of the T20 in Buenos Aires. A gentleman made a presentation. He said, if you merged Mercosur, that's the common market in South America, with the common market in Mesoamerica and CARICOM, you would create a very, very large common single market where labor, capital, goods, and everything could move around in the same way that it does in Europe. And he said he's done the work. It didn't really matter what bad things happened to any country then. They would all be better off than they would be now. So he says if we could drop the barriers to moving labor, and I'm pretty sure CARICOM at some point all agreed that we should have a Caribbean single market and economy. So all you who know for sure that you can go anywhere in the Caribbean that you want and pick up a job tomorrow, just indicate by raising your hand in the reaction. So we all know that we decided we were going to have a CSME, and all the Caribbean countries immediately acted on that, right? Except that a lot of countries didn't want Jamaicans and Haitians and Guyanese in their countries, so they put up barriers. The barriers that we have against our ability to have more diverse economies are not necessarily all barriers imposed on us by the OECD. There are a whole suite of barriers that CARICOM has imposed on itself. We need to address those. We need to make sure that the only barriers are the external ones. And yes, we should be making sure that we double or triple everybody's education budget.
Good point, Dr. Smith. I have a question in the chat from Edward Williams. Edward, would you like to say it orally, or would you like me to read it for you? I don't see Edward, so I'll read this question. Good afternoon, Dr. Smith. You said moving hospitals from the coast. What key structural, architectural, and operational considerations are required to design and build hospitals that can withstand Category 5 hurricanes? Did anyone consider building underground hospitals or health centers in key areas in the country?
Okay, a couple of things let's bear in mind. Take into account the context as well. There are many buildings in Jamaica which are still used by government, which are really of great historical value and interest. So for example, the General Penitentiary, downtown Kingston. It's a beautiful old building. There is absolutely no reason why it should be used as a prison. It is of great architectural value. It was built hundreds of years ago. Similarly, Black River Hospital and others. The buildings were damaged and destroyed. Let's not think that it was because they were the best buildings and they were built for purpose in the sense that they were resistant to what we knew was likely to take place. On the other hand, Cornwall Regional Hospital, which was built in the 70s, did much better. And we know how to build lifelines for Category 5 events. We need to know where to locate them, so we need to find a suitable place that's not going to be flooded from the sea, and also not going to be flooded from riverine flooding. We need to build suitable concrete buildings that will be able to do that, and we need to site them as well so that they're not on an active earthquake fault. But we can do it. The problem is that we inherited a lot of things, and maybe we can, but why is it in Black River? Because Black River was the parish capital. Why was Black River the parish capital? Because most of our parish capitals were ports. Why were they ports? Because when Jamaica was one of the most important parts of the British Empire, it was important because of all the things you could export from it. So parish capitals were ports. You could export logwood, sugar, all kinds of things from Black River. And so, yes, of course, you put the hospital right beside the sea, because that's where the town was. It made sense back then, but we've moved on. So we definitely need to move our government buildings away from the sea and start looking at making sure that, all these things which are there because during the days of slavery, the British built on right beside the sea because they didn't necessarily go up into the hills except to escape malaria. We don't have to follow everything they did.
Thank you for that. I see one more question. Elizabeth is asking, what would you say is a reasonable percentage for any country to apply to climate change action? I think it was 1% in Jamaica, but what would you suggest? And this is going to be our last question.
I'm thinking we need to look much more like at about 10 to 20% if we are in SIDS, where we are in a situation where we are likely to be experiencing this kind of event. And remember what I said at the beginning, over the last 8 years, every other year, somebody in the Caribbean was hit by a Category 5. So unfortunately, we need to accelerate because we're in a clear and present danger. Afterwards, maybe we can slack off after we've redone our lifelines and all the rest of it, but not until then.
I think that's going to take a considerable amount of time and money before we can slack off, if ever. Dr. Smith, thank you for a very engaging presentation. Ladies and gentlemen, let's give Dr. Smith a hand to say thank you. Thank you guys so much for coming today. And one final piece. Many of you are probably wondering if you can take a program or a course on climate change or things that have to do with the SDG 13. And indeed, there is an ISDJ program on climate action. So I'm suggesting that you take a look at that. This video will be available on the ISDJ YouTube channel. So you can go there and see it or tell your friends if they happen to miss it. So ladies and gentlemen, and to our presenter, thank you very much for coming. It's been a wonderful time with you and have a great afternoon. Bye-bye.